I've always considered myself an adventurer. It started when I was a kid, disappearing into the woods behind our house for hours on end, pretending I was an explorer discovering new lands. As I got older, that curiosity only grew. Hiking became my escape from the monotony of daily life, a chance to disconnect, clear my head, and experience something raw and untouched by modern chaos. It wasn't just about the exercise, it was about the stories. Every trail had its own tale, from old legends passed down by locals to rumors whispered online. That's how I stumbled upon the story of Black Hollow Trail. Black Hollow wasn't on any official maps, and finding information about it was like chasing shadows. What I did find was a mix of chilling folklore and cryptic warnings. People talked about vanishing hikers, strange sights in the trees, and an eerie silence that would settle over the area at dusk. Some claimed there was a predator, something unnatural that stalked the trail. Others said it was haunted by the spirits of those who had died there, doomed to lure more people to their fate. As someone who thrives on the strange and unexplained, I couldn't resist. I wasn't naive. I knew the dangers of hiking in remote areas. But part of me couldn't shake the thought that most of the stories were just that. Stories. I spent days preparing for the trip. My backpack was packed with the essentials: water, protein bars, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a sturdy knife. I also brought a high-quality camera. I told myself it was for documenting the trail, but deep down, I wanted proof. If I saw something unusual, I wanted to capture it. My phone was fully charged, though I didn't expect service out there. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just in case someone tried to talk me out of it. I simply mentioned I was taking a weekend hiking trip and would be back by Monday. It was a crisp morning when I reached the start of the trail, or what I assumed was the start. The entrance wasn't marked, just a narrow path cutting through dense trees. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth. The wind was muted, brushing against the leaves without the usual rustle. I shrugged off the unease. This was why I was here, to experience something different, something wild. The first few hours were fun. The trail was rough but manageable, winding through towering pines and patches of thick underbrush. I stopped occasionally to take photos, sunlight filtering through the trees, a curious fox darting across my path, a particularly gnarled tree trunk that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. It wasn't until I noticed the first carcass that the atmosphere began to shift. It was a deer, its body slumped against a tree at an unnatural angle. Its neck was twisted, and its eyes stared blankly at nothing. I would have assumed it had been attacked by a predator, but something about it didn't sit right with me. For one, there was no sign of a struggle, no tracks, no blood trail. And then there was the placement. Looking up, I noticed another deer's body tangled in the branches above. How had it gotten there? I didn't want to linger. The air felt colder here and I started to feel fear. An hour later, I found a journal. It was lying in the middle of the path, its leather cover scuffed and damp. At first, I thought someone had dropped it, but when I opened it, the pages were yellowed with age. The first few entries were illegible, but as I flipped through, I found a list of rules written on one of the middle pages. Rule 1. If you see a cabin or any man-made structure, do not enter. It's a trap. Rule 2. If you see a body of an animal hanging in the trees, do not look at its face. Pretend it isn't there and walk faster. If it calls to you, do not respond. Rule 3. Use your camera to see where the entity is for your safety. If it's close to you in the image, move away from it quickly before it touches you. Rule 4. If the trail becomes littered with fresh bones, turn back immediately. It means the predator is near. Rule 5. If you find a rope hanging from a tree with a knot tied at the bottom, do not touch it. That rope has already claimed someone, and it's waiting for another. Rule 6. If the moon suddenly turns red, do not look up. The predator walks openly when the moon changes, and looking at it draws its attention to you. Feeling spooked, I slipped the journal into my bag, feeling its weight as I continued. The trail grew harder to navigate the deeper I went. The trees seemed closer together, their branches clawing at the sky. I noticed more carcasses, small animals at first, then larger ones. Each time I kept my gaze low, remembering Rule 2. I wasn't superstitious, but something about the journal clung to me, a nagging presence I couldn't shake. I tried to distract myself by taking photos, capturing the unsettling beauty of the forest. That's when I noticed the figure. It was in the corner of the frame, barely visible against the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the branches. But when I looked closer, I saw it was shaped like a person, though its proportions were wrong. Too long, too thin. I spun around, my heart racing, but the path behind me was empty. I told myself it was nothing. I'd been hiking for hours, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I kept the camera in my hand, glancing at the screen every few minutes. It became a ritual: take a photo, check the image, move on. When I reached a clearing, the sight stopped me cold. The ground was scattered with bones, their surfaces gleaming as if they'd been picked clean. My first instinct was to turn back, but something caught my eye: a rope hanging from a tree. It swayed gently, though there was no breeze. The knot at the bottom seemed deliberate, almost inviting. My chest tightened as I remembered Rule 5. My hands itched to touch the rope, to feel its coarse fibers, but I shoved them into my pockets and backed away. The bones crunched underfoot, and I flinched at the sound. I checked my camera again, and there it was, that figure, closer this time, its head tilted as if it were studying me. I didn't wait to see if it would follow. My pace quickened, and the further I went, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. The silence was broken only by the rustle of leaves. I felt the journal in my bag, its presence heavier than before. Something was wrong, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what. I pressed on. My camera remained in my hand, the screen dark until I nervously snapped another picture. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't resist checking. The figure was still there, closer than before. It was just on the edge of the frame, half obscured by the trees. Its shape was clearer now, its limbs long, its body thin and crooked. Its face, if it even had one, was hidden in the shadows. I shoved the camera back into my bag, my pulse hammering in my ears. I started walking faster, the crunch of dirt and leaves beneath my boots sounding unbearably loud. The trees ahead seemed endless, stretching into a tunnel of darkness. I didn't dare stop, even when I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. Branches swaying, shadows darting between the trunks. My mind raced as I thought about the rules. I'd already encountered the bones, the rope, and possibly the predator. What was next? The cabin? The red moon? My gut twisted at the thought, but I wanted to be the first person to capture real footage of the abnormalities in this hiking trail. Then I heard something, a high-pitched sound, like a whistle or a scream carried on the wind. I was going to run, but I remembered the rules. If it was coming from one of the carcasses, I couldn't respond. I forced myself to keep moving. The sound followed me, weaving through the trees like it had a mind of its own. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was something else, something wrong. My hands trembled as I reached into my bag and pulled out the camera again. If the rules were right, it was my only way of seeing whatever was out there. I snapped a photo, holding my breath as the camera processed the image. The screen flickered, and my heart nearly stopped. The figure was there, no longer in the distance but standing on the trail directly in my path. Its shape was distorted, its limbs bending in a way that disgusted me. Its head was tilted as if acknowledging me. I lowered the camera and stared ahead, but the trail was empty. My breath came out in shallow gasps, and I realized my legs had frozen in place. Move, move now. My brain screamed the command, and I finally obeyed, stumbling forward. The sound had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt worse. Every nerve in my body was on edge, my senses hyper-focused on the smallest details. The crunch of leaves, the faint rustle of branches, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I knew something was following me. I passed another clearing and my stomach dropped. Hanging in the center, suspended from a thick branch, was another rope. This one was different, frayed and stained. The knot at the bottom pulled tight as if it had been used recently. I stepped around it carefully, avoiding even the shadow it cast. The urge to grab it, to test its weight, was almost overwhelming, but I clenched my fists and kept walking. The trail grew darker still, the sunlight barely penetrating the canopy above. My flashlight became my lifeline, its beam cutting through the gloom. I checked my camera again, snapping another photo. The figure was still there, now impossibly close, its face, or where a face should have been, barely visible in the corner of the frame. My hands shook as I stared at the screen, and for the first time, I noticed something else. Its hand, long and skeletal, was reaching toward me. I shoved the camera into my bag and broke into a run. I didn't care about the noise I was making or the risk of tripping. I just needed to get out, to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever that thing was. The trail blurred around me, my vision tunneling as adrenaline took over. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. Then I saw it, a shape in the distance, a structure barely visible through the trees. My heart sank as I realized what it was. A cabin. Rule 1. Do not enter any man-made structure. It's a trap. But there was nowhere else to go. I could feel something really close to me. The cabin loomed closer, its wooden walls weathered and dark. There was no sign of life, no lights in the windows or smoke from a chimney. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. My feet faltered, and I hesitated at the edge of the clearing. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my ragged breaths. And then I heard it again, that whistle, faint and chilling, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. My stomach churned as I realized the sound wasn't random. It was calling to me. I turned away, forcing myself to focus on the trail ahead, and started walking again. I had to get as far away as possible. I didn't look back, but I felt it, the cabin's presence lingering behind me. My flashlight flickered, and panic surged through me. I slapped it against my hand, willing it to stay on, and kept moving. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a new sound, a different kind of scream that sent shivers down my spine. It was deep and inhuman, a sound that didn't belong to anything. I clenched my fists, gripping the flashlight tighter, and forced myself to keep going. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. I pushed forward, my senses on overdrive, every sound amplified to an unbearable degree. The scream I'd heard earlier was no longer far away. It seemed to echo through the trees, weaving around me. My flashlight flickered again, this time sputtering completely before plunging me into darkness. I cursed under my breath, fumbling to pull out my phone for its weak flashlight. The narrow beam illuminated only a few feet ahead, the surrounding woods now shrouded in impenetrable black. I tried to tell myself I was still on the trail, but the ground beneath my boots felt uneven, scattered with debris I hadn't noticed before. Then I saw it: bones. Not just scattered fragments like before, but an entire stretch of the path littered with broken ribs, cracked femurs, and skulls split cleanly in half. They were fresh, glistening with something that gleamed wetly in the dim light. Rule hit me like a punch to the gut. If the trail becomes littered with fresh bones, turn back immediately. It means the predator is near. My legs froze, my breath catching in my throat. Turning back seemed impossible, knowing what might be behind me, but staying here felt like suicide. A sharp snapping sound broke the silence, a branch cracking underfoot. It wasn't mine. My head whipped to the side, my phone shaking in my hand as the beam of light darted between the trees. I couldn't see anything, but the sound had been close, too close. I forced myself to take a step back, my boots crunching over the scattered bones. The snapping came again, like something was testing how close it could get before I noticed. I spun, trying to catch sight of whatever was stalking me, but the forest gave me nothing, just an oppressive darkness and the overwhelming sense of being hunted. Then I made a mistake. My phone, trembling in my grip, caught the face of one of the carcasses hanging in the trees. My eyes lingered for barely a second, but it was enough. The deer's head, contorted and broken, it twisted toward me. Its lifeless eyes burned into mine, and I saw its mouth open, cracked and bloodied, as if it were trying to speak. I stumbled back, dropping my phone. It hit the ground with a thud, and the light went out. The darkness became absolute, wrapping around me like a blanket. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scrambled to find the phone, my hands frantically searching through the dirt and bones. Then I heard a voice, low and raspy. It sounded like a dozen throats speaking at once, echoing from the direction of the hanging deer. "Look at me," it hissed. The words were slow and drawn out, dripping with malice. My entire body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, crouched in the dirt as the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Look at me." My fingers finally found the phone, and I clutched it hard, fumbling to turn the flashlight back on. When the beam finally illuminated the forest again, the deer's face was right there. It was so close, hanging just inches from mine. Its eyes were gone, its jaw hanging open to reveal jagged, broken teeth. The voice came again, now directly in my ear. "Why won't you look?" I screamed, pushing myself back and breaking into a full sprint, leaving the trail of bones and the haunting voice behind. My heart thundered in my chest as I ran blindly through the forest, my phone's light bouncing erratically with each step. Branches clawed at my face and arms. I didn't dare look back. When I finally slowed, gasping for breath, I realized I was somewhere unfamiliar. The trail was gone, replaced by dense trees and uneven ground. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea where I was. I grabbed the camera from my bag, snapping a photo in desperation. The screen lit up with the image, and I almost puked. The figure wasn't in the distance anymore. It was directly behind me, its grotesque form towering over my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The silence pressed in again, heavier than before, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. My knees felt weak, and I leaned against a tree to steady myself. As I tried to catch my breath, something cold brushed against my hand. I recoiled, shining my phone's light down to see what it was. A rope hung from the branch above, its knot swaying slightly as if recently disturbed. I stepped back, the memory of Rule 5 ringing in my ears. Do not touch it. That rope has already claimed someone and it's waiting for another. The knot seemed to tighten as I stared at it, the fibers fraying and twisting. It almost looked alive. I turned away, determined to find my way back to the trail, but the sound of creaking would stop me in my tracks. I glanced back and my blood ran cold. The rope wasn't just hanging anymore. It was stretching, elongating as if something unseen was pulling it downward. A shape began to form beneath it, translucent at first but slowly solidifying into something human-like. The thing took a step forward. It moved in a way I can't describe. The screaming sound returned, this time from all around me, as if the forest itself were alive with it. My survival instincts kicked in, and I ran again, this time with no sense of direction. My only goal was to escape, but the forest seemed endless, the trees closing in tighter the further I went. My phone's battery was draining rapidly, the light dimming with every passing second. I tripped over a root, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through my ankle, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. I could hear something behind me now, like heavy footsteps chasing me through the underbrush. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain, and limped forward as fast as I could. The trees parted suddenly, revealing another clearing. My heart sank as I saw what lay ahead. It wasn't the safety of an open field or a road. It was the cabin, the same one I'd seen before, now somehow in a completely different location. Its dark windows stared at me like empty eyes, and the door creaked open slightly, inviting me in. I backed away, only to feel something cold and wet touch my shoulder. There was nothing there, yet the sensation lingered, like icy fingers trailing across my skin. I snapped a picture with my camera, the flash briefly illuminating the clearing. When the image appeared on the screen, my heart nearly stopped. The figure stood near the cabin, its lanky form half hidden in shadow. It was closer than before, its glowing eyes fixated on me. My stomach churned as I remembered Rule 3. Move away before it touches you. Forcing my legs to move, I stumbled back into the tree-line, keeping my eyes on the cabin, only to feel a tug in my mind, a strange pull toward it. The journal's words echoed in my thoughts. Do not enter. It's a trap. But every step away felt wrong, as though the forest itself were pushing me back. The trail opened again, revealing bones scattered across the dirt. Fresh bones. My heart raced as I remembered Rule 4. Turn back immediately if the trail becomes littered with bones. But turning back wasn't an option. The way I'd come was gone, the forest closing in as if sealing me in a maze. I pushed forward, snapping photos with my camera every few steps, praying the battery would hold. Each image revealed nothing at first, just the same dark trees and empty trail. Then, in one frame, I saw it again. The figure was standing directly behind me, its face hidden but its glowing eyes burning into my back. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I clutched the journal from my bag. It had been my guide through this nightmare, and now it was my last hope. I flipped it open, my trembling fingers struggling to turn the pages. The rules were still there, but beneath them, new lines had appeared. My blood ran cold as I read the words. The red jacket stands out in the dark. He follows the rules, but they lead him here. I stared at the page, my vision blurring as new text began to materialize in jagged handwriting. He stops at the cabin, afraid to enter. The predator watches from the trees. My hands shook violently as I turned the page, desperate for answers, but the entries only grew more specific. He clutches the journal, his breath shallow. His secrets are known. He can't escape. The forest around me seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the air vibrating with an unspoken threat. My body felt weak as I read the final page, which had been blank when I first found the journal. Now it began to fill in before my eyes, each word written in a heavy, deliberate stroke. He reads his fate in the pages. He is watched. He is hunted. My heart pounded as the last line appeared, the ink drying almost instantly. And then he looked behind him, my breath caught in my throat. Every fiber of my being screamed at me not to look behind, not to confirm what I already knew. But I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head, and the last thing I saw were two glowing eyes, impossibly close, and a wide, grinning mouth that seemed to stretch endlessly in the darkness.